Andrew, glad we got this worked out, and thanks for coming on with us this afternoon.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, let's just talk a little bit about what you do on your site, Dude You Crazy, Georgia football, and what y'all cover, and the podcast and things like that.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, I write for DudeYouCrazy.net. It's a small little site that I started about 3 years ago. The goal of the site initially was just to stop talking to my wife about college football. I got married right after college, and I could tell she didn't enjoy college football quite as much as my college roommate. So started writing, and the site has slowly grown. I get press credentials. We've got a podcast that we do, the Dude You podcast. It's on iTunes and everywhere else. We're very heavy on Georgia football, where I went to school. We also cover the SEC in general and a little bit of ACC action. So we try to give an emphasis to our main fan base, which is Georgia fans, but we do cover a little bit of everything in college football.
Right. And, talk about, the year, I guess the recap, obviously Georgia came up here and really, really good ball game. We knew it was going to be a physical game, lost in the tough, but they did rebound. And I think, the injury bug just got them this year. I mean, they had so much talent, just the injuries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I look back at the season. If you told me, this time last year that Georgia would be 4-1 and then they'd survive an overtime win, at Neyland Stadium up in Tennessee, I feel really, really good about the season. Unfortunately, that Tennessee game was really when things fell apart. I had 3 players go down with torn ACLs or at least with knee injuries that game. Obviously, we lost Malcolm Mitchell against Clemson in the season opener, before he even touched the ball all season. So a little bit of a disappointing season in that regard. The defense, I don't think, quite developed the way many people thought it would. Sure, it was a young defense, but I think there were a lot of questions as to why the defense was so young. There seemed to be an absence of veteran defensive backs who could step up and make plays. So I think offense was really handicapped by injuries. Defense was really handicapped by maybe a lack of leadership in the secondary.
Right. And Andrew, what can you say? I see an article on your blog about January, the busiest off-season month in Georgia history. What can you tell us about the hires Georgia made? In my mind, great hires.
Yes, it's been absolutely wild. I mean, you look just 3 weeks ago, it looked like everyone was coming back. Much to the chagrin of Georgia fans, Mark Richt stuck by Todd Grantham, and they were going to have him back for another year, which ultimately I think was probably the right decision. I don't think the defense was probably as bad as people like to give it credit for or maybe discredit for. You look at what Georgia's defense did, and relative to the opponents they played, we played a lot of really talented offensive teams, obviously Clemson being one of them, but also LSU and a few teams that weren't on our schedule the year before. I don't know that the defense underperformed any more than they did last year, to be honest with you. So, the plan was to kind of have continuity, which Mark Richt kept saying continuity is a good thing for Georgia. And I think everybody, whether they liked it or not, was kind of braced for that. And then all of a sudden, you had Scott Lakatos resign as a defensive backs coach. You had Todd Grantham 2 days later decide he was going to go to Louisville for a 5-year contract guaranteed at $1 million a year. Can't blame him for that. I don't think Georgia really had any intention of trying to match that. All of a sudden, things just started falling into place, and Jeremy Pruitt was a tremendous hire, one that I don't think you could question. In a span of 48 hours, whether he turns out to be everything we think he will or not, that remains to be seen. But within 48 hours, we basically traded his defensive coordinator that the average fan was very low on for a defensive coordinator that's coming off a national championship. So that was quite a trade-off, and obviously I think they've done a great job of kind of filling 2 more assistant spots. So been very pleased with the hires. It's been very busy, very hectic. Typically moves like this seem to happen earlier in the off-season or even before bowl season. So it's been kind of fun, giving us a little bit of a cure for the football hangover, so to speak.
Talk about also the Tracy Rocker hire. I really liked it. I thought that was a really good. Where did he come from?
Yeah, Tracy Rocker was a fantastic hire. I think he's a little bit of an underrated coach.
Right.
Defensive line coach from the Tennessee Titans,
okay,
where he was last. I think the great things about Rocker, several of which I think tie directly to recruiting season, which we're kind of right in the middle of, but he's coached all over the SEC. He was one of the best defensive linemen in SEC history in the late 80s, won the Outland and the Lombardi Trophy while playing at Auburn. He's coached at Auburn. He won a BCS national championship there, kind of coached up Nick Fairley and some of those guys while he was there. He's coached at Mississippi State. He's been all over the place. Also, most recently in the NFL, and I think that's a real selling point for recruits is the fact that this guy can develop young defensive linemen at the college level, but he also knows what it takes to succeed at the pro level.
Right, I agree with you there. Anytime you can pull someone from the NFL down, that's a good hire in my mind. But talk about the recruiting that's been going on. Obviously, that's always going on. But beyond these hires, what's going on in the recruiting world?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit interesting. Georgia's always recruitment for Georgia is a little bit of a two-edged sword. I think Georgia does a really good job early on securing commitment. You can look at their roster, and they've got 17 commitments, and 14 of them, I believe, have been committed for over 6 months. So Georgia does a really good job of getting in early. They do a great job with summer camps. They do a great job of getting early offers out to in-state talent. So Georgia always does a good job there. Why I call it a two-edged sword is the flip side is there's not always an exciting finish. You know, a lot of times the most talented players in the class have been committed for some time, so you don't quite have that dramatic closing of the recruiting season. This year it might be a little bit different. You've got guys like Lorenzo Carter, who's still out there, Bryson Allen Williams, who I think is probably going to South Carolina, but is still at least considering an official visit this weekend to Georgia. There's a lot of big-time players that are still out there for Georgia to close on.
There definitely is. And, well, you know, looking ahead to next year, obviously Clemson has got to go play down there. And I think that's going to be one of the, you know, better matchups of the first week. Looking way ahead, you know, it should be, I don't think the teams will be quite as highly ranked as they were this year.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think it's going to be another fun game. Really glad to see this rivalry back. I hope it gets renewed in some capacity, even if it's not every year. I think it's going to be a great early season game. I think Clemson's defense is probably a little bit more intense than we expected as Georgia fans going into the season last year. And you've got that defensive line coming back with guys like Vic Beasley. That's going to be, in my mind, kind of the way too early, I guess, key to the game is how Hudson Mason is a relatively new starter at quarterback can handle that, because really he's the only new cog. Even on the offensive line, we're replacing 3 starters, but we're replacing them with 3 guys that played a whole lot of football over the last couple of years. So I think the offense is once again going to be potent. The defense, we've got to hope, makes steps forward. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit difficult, even with a new defensive coordinator, no matter how good he is. There's going to be a transition, but we have high expectations, maybe higher internally than the rest of the country does, but that's kind of a Georgia trend.
Right, and also in that game last year, had a lot of people playing on Clemson's roster from the state of Georgia. You know, people like defensive end Corey Crawford from Columbus made the huge interception, so also a little bit of that motivation factor probably got passed over a little bit, and you know, but it should be a really good game next year. Talk a little bit about, you know, and I know people make, you know, puns and things about some of the problems that Georgia's had in the offseason with players and stuff. Talk about Harvey Clements. I mean, what's his status? Has he already been, will he play, or has he been suspended next year also?
Yeah, Harvey Clements will be out for the first game, most likely out for the second as well. Very disappointing. He's a guy who I think has unbelievable talent. Unfortunately, you know, he's just not on the field a lot. He was hurt a little bit this year, and I think one of the things that really hurt Georgia's defense was there's only 3 games in which both starting safeties were able to play. So that was a bit of a you know, poor situation last year. Looks like it's rolling into this year as far as his decision making. He's a young kid. I think he's extremely talented. You got to hope that he kind of straightens out from this, learns from this, and can develop. I've seen a lot of encouragement coming from his teammates, whether it's on Twitter or in interviews, things like that. I think the team's behind him. I think the team wants him to kind of rectify the issues he's had, and I do think he's going to be a contributor down the road later in the season, but unfortunately he will be out for the Clemson game.
Right. You talk about Hudson Mason, who got some playing time at the end of last year, led a comeback versus Georgia Tech. With Aaron Murray gone, a really solid quarterback, is Hudson Mason going to be the guy down there?
Yeah, Hudson Mason's the guy through and through, and the nice thing for Mason is he's got so many weapons around him. You look at players that are returning, and obviously you've got Todd Gurley back at running back, one of the best running backs in the country. But the hope is you get Keith Marshall back from injury at some point early in the season. And it looks like he is on track to do that. You look at the receivers he's had last year, they're pretty much all back except for Tyson and Arthur Lynch. Not only that, but you get a guy like Malcolm Mitchell back. So he's going to have tremendous weapons around him. He's going to be able to kind of embrace that game manager role, so to speak, and I hate using that term, but you know, his job is going to be to get the ball to his weapons, and I think he'll be able to do that.
I think he'll be, and you know, the whole off season, get some spring practice and stuff under his belt and all the practices. But yeah, it should be a really good game again next year. Does Georgia's? I don't know if you probably looked at it. does their schedule set up? You know, it was pretty gauntlet last year. Does it set up a little easier for them next year?
Still a tough start with Clemson, and then followed by South Carolina. So a little bit tough early. The nice thing, you know, as far as conference scheduling goes, the big and good news is we dodge both LSU and Alabama, and also I guess Texas A&M is kind of rising in that hierarchy. So Georgia manages to dodge both of those powerhouses as well as an up-and-coming Western foe. So that's good news. Georgia picks up Arkansas on the road, which based on last season's performance probably is not a game that's going to be a huge cause for concern. Obviously, Missouri's a program that's on the rise. They're going to have a good bit of talent back, so that could be a threat. I think Tennessee will be better, but overall, Georgia's schedule is pretty favorable.
Yeah, I mean, it couldn't get much harder than they had it last year. That's why I'm saying after they lost Clemson on the road, going back and beating the Chickens and the Tigers from LSU was pretty amazing accomplishment. But Andrew, we really appreciate you joining us this afternoon, and we'll definitely get you back on as we get closer to that game between the Hedges next year. Look forward to it, and thanks again, and keep up the great work at DudeYouCrazy.net.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right, thank you. And that's Andrew Hall from DudeYouCrazy.net.